right, welcome everybody to our EOL seminar. Today we welcome Erin Robinson. Erin Robertson. Robinson. Jesus.
It's okay.
I'll get it right one day. Anyway, she's the executive director of the Foundation for Earth Science, which is a small nonprofit organization located right here in Boulder. Which was created about 15 years ago in 2001 by the Federation of Earth Science Information Partners, ESIP. And you see the logo there on the top left, if you want to be reminded. The Foundation for Earth Science receives funding from NASA, NOAA, NSF, Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, and a number of other philanthropic and academic sources. So it's quite broadly placed.
Yeah.
Well, I think we can say that. Erin works at the intersection of community informatics, earth science, and nonprofit management. Over the last 10 years, she honed an eclectic skill set, both technical and managerial, creating communities and programs with lasting impact around science, data, and technology. She wrote this. I don't think I could have written it so nicely, but it helps.
I've only written it, you know. Hearing it read, I'm a little embarrassed.
No, that sounds good. Thank you. It's a big help for me. Erin is passionate about fostering innovation through collaboration across diverse nodes and facilitates collaboration among earth science technology practitioners, scientists, and other data folks like us here. To expedite progress toward data interoperability. Let's think about that. Okay, yeah. Done. Erin got her bachelor's degree in chemical engineering and a master's degree in environmental engineering, both from Washington University in St. Louis. And following her master's 6 years ago, she joined the Foundation of Earth Science as Information and Virtual Community Director. And she's now the executive director. So with that introduction, please welcome Erin for her talk, Making Data Better, Using Collective Impact to Move Forward Together. Erin, please.
Thank you so much. And thank you for that introduction. Like I said, I've never heard my bio read before, and that's kind of nice. So today I wanted to talk about ESIP, but I also wanted to talk about something called collective impact, which is a framework that I use to describe ESIP, but I'm hoping that this talk is more relevant broadly to all of you who work in collaborative projects. So I wanted to start with a little story about why I care about earth science data and information. And so actually I think that I picked the right kind of story when I was talking with Holger. So this was my first hurricane. It was Fran. It came on the coast of North Carolina in 1996. And when I was pulling this slide together, the picture that I actually was thinking of was this picture here. And this was my parents' backyard. That's my little brother, Wiley. And this gives some context to the size and the damage that the hurricane did. It was a Category 3 when it came through Raleigh, which is in the center of North Carolina. And when initially I pulled this together as an earth science story, right? I've been through a hurricane and I understand kind of the complex nature of the different kinds of data that are required to forecast landfall, to work on disaster preparedness and damage assessment afterwards. But actually, as I've been kind of working this slide over, it's really a story about data. And so the first picture I knew existed. I remembered it from growing up. But I couldn't find it. I couldn't access it. I had to call my mom. It was in a data format that I couldn't easily include in my presentation. And so, after some hoop jumping and my mom looking for it, we found it. And so that's where a lot of earth science data lives, right? That we might know it exists, but we don't know how to get it. It's in a format that we can't understand. It's not easy to use. Those are common hurdles. This data on the right, when I started pulling this together, I Googled Hurricane Fran, and the National Weather Service has a great page on Fran with all of this data that you can look back at. And so it was easy to access. I was able to just grab this GIF and stick it in my PowerPoint. And both sort of both ends of the spectrum, right? Hard to access, easy to access, and most earth science data is in that spectrum. I think another thing to note just about this story is that neither of these things were originally created for me to use to tell this story. So a lot of earth science data is used now for unintended purposes, and because it's freely and openly available. So that's really where we start, or where I start. And both the data challenges and the challenges around hurricane forecasting or any of these kind of environmental challenges that are studied at NCAR, I think fall into something called collective impact initiatives. And if you've heard me talk, this is one of my favorite ideas, but this is a framework that helps people solve complex problems by bringing together stakeholders from across sectors around a shared agenda. And there are few characteristics of this. One, these are primarily social problems and the solutions arise from multiple interacting factors. The organizations actively coordinate actions in they have shared lessons learned. And I think this is a critical bullet because it's not a passive collaboration, but your organizations are actively orienting around this shared agenda. And this piece about shared lessons is, how do you learn and iterate and move forward? And then the last bullet, which is a piece that I'll come back to, is on the necessity of a backbone organization. And ESIP is an example of a backbone organization. But I think when I talk about this, I'd also like you to think about UCAR as an example of a backbone organization as well. So a little bit of background about ESIP, which is the Earth Science Information Partners. ESIP was formed in 1998 by a recommendation to NASA from the National Academy of Science that they needed more community input into their Earth observing systems. And so they funded 24 projects, 12 were research, 12 were applications, and then they also brought in the 12 NASA DACs. And this actually set the stage for having the data, having stakeholders from across the data lifecycle coming together. But over the course of the last almost 20 years, what we've seen is that we've grown across sector, across domain, because like I mentioned at the beginning, these data challenges are really common. And so, it's often people that are, trying to deal with metadata. It doesn't matter if they're in air quality or if they're in energy, the standard is the same, or the data access challenges are the same. And so people coming together can learn from each other. And so now nobody is funded directly by ESIP to participate, and they're coming together because it's good for for their own career, for their own organization, and they're getting value out of this community participation. So, as I mentioned, we have a couple of different types of ESIP members, and in parentheses, I just gave the Colorado-specific view here. So these are names that you know. In the research section, LASP, Ronan Institute, and Gaia are also with NCAR, and then you're all familiar with Unidata and Globe, I'm sure. And then from all of these members, there's about 170 members now, and each member organization has one voting representative, and Mike Daniels is the voting rep for NCAR, and so Mike gets a lot of information from us and then shares it with you all, I hope. But Mike is also one of the reasons that I'm here talking, and so I think that this is a way for us to dive in deeper to the organizations that are already members. We have an annual business meeting, and then the leadership is elected from our member organizations. So together, these people orient around a community vision to be a leader in promoting collection, stewardship, and use of earth science data. So this is one part of our shared agenda. And then the other part of the shared agenda really comes in three pieces. So first is our strategic plan, which gives some chaos. I think when you look at ESIP, one of the things that we hear is that this is a large community and there's a lot of moving parts, and how do you kind of make order from this messy thing. So one way that we do that is orienting around a shared agenda, and one part of that agenda is the strategic plan. And then out of that, we're focusing on one particular goal this year. And so I'll talk about clusters and committees, but our meetings and a lot of activities that we have going on this year are specifically focused on strengthening the ties between observation and user communities. And so if there are things going on at NCAR that are specific, that might help strengthen this theme, or things that ESIP could help promote, that would be really terrific here. And then the third part of the shared agenda is ESIP's values. And so like I mentioned, as a critical part of collective impact is the sharing of lessons learned. ESIP is this open participatory community and has created this neutral space where people coming from these different organizations feel safe enough to share both the successes and the failures of trying to accomplish these strategic goals, trying to accomplish making data matter in their own organizations, and I think that there's a lot of value to that forum. So that's really where I want to pause here and give you the first thing that I hope that you take away from this talk, and that's one is to be selfish. I think often we think of being selfish as really a negative thing, but to participate in any of these collaborative communities, EarthCube, the Research Data Alliance, ESTEP is another, ESIP, it seems like there's new ones every day, to make the decision to try to figure out how your own work fits with the work that's being done by the community. And then the second part of this is that the community is a really valuable resource. By bringing together all of these people with expertise and knowledge and experiences, and being able to tap that resource, your home organization gains a lot from having this kind of external network to draw from. So I think those are two parts, maybe of the same coin. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the backbone organization, which is one of the key parts of collective impact. And if you're interested in collective impact in general, the Stanford Social Innovation Review this is where the idea came from, and they have a lot of resources on it. But that's really the part of the collective impact that keeps the lights on. It maintains the overall strategic coherence. We plan. These are the functions. We plan meetings, we do evaluation of ESIP, we help move the work forward, but one key thing is that we don't set the agenda. So the strategic plan, the theme for the year, the activities that the groups undertake, the work that the groups do, all of that is driven by the community. And what I'm doing and what ESIP is, what the backbone organization part of this is doing is just helping to move to move things forward. And so I think you can see maybe where there's some similarities with UCAR being kind of a backbone organization in bulk for a lot of collective impact activities and collaborative activities that are going on here. And so one way that I describe the backbone is through this jungle gym. And part of the backbone is the staff. And so this is the team that I work with. Bruce Karen is our community architect. Annie Burgess is the director of the ESIP lab and a lot of the technical activities that go on with ESIP. And then Dan and Annie Keys are our operations and logistics team, and they do a lot of meeting planning as well as making sure that the infrastructure, the ESIP infrastructure is up and running. Does that make sense to everybody? Maybe I'll pause. Yeah. So in addition to the staff, we also have a suite of services. So we have communication resources. We, every Monday, have a Monday update that goes out from us that's kind of a digest of all the things going on in ESIP, but we also have listservs for two-way communication and social media channels where we know that our members are participating, so we don't feel like we have to be everywhere, but we are some places. We have meeting infrastructure, both for in-person and for virtual meetings. And then we have a suite of services for collaborative work, including cloud capabilities, GitHub, the wiki, and a couple of Drupal websites that all support the community. And I think one other thing to note, this looks like a lot of stuff, but really what we have found is that over the last 20 years, we iterate on what we need, and the community is telling us, we need cloud services, and then as the backbone organization, we figure out how to make that happen. And all of these resources are free to the community, free to all of you, open and accessible, and so you don't even have to be officially an ESIP member to participate in and to use these resources. The whole point is to lower the barrier to collaboration. And then this is a little bit of a play on this, but what the community does on top of this infrastructure is really up to the community. And so I really want to drive home the point that the community is deciding which direction to go, is setting the agenda, and is really making, is essential to the collective impact process. So the second takeaway from my talk is to leverage the backbone infrastructure to lower the barriers to collaboration. And one question that I get a lot when I talk about ESIP is, so what kind of data sets do you have and how can we access your data? And so this slide is really to make the point, I guess I can use my pointer, to make the point that ESIP really operates up here, that we bring people together at the top of this interoperability stack in something that we call humanware or collaborative infrastructure. So the wiki, the Drupal sites, the GoToMeeting, all the things that connect people. And by connecting people, they learn from each other and then and agree on consensus on different conventions or best practices. And then they move back to their home organizations and they actually implement things. So we see interoperability happening because we've made these, we've helped make these connections up here. So this kind of moves into, we've talked about why we do what we do and what we do, and now I'm going to talk a little bit about how. So ESIP has two kinds of structures. One is a cluster, which is really lightweight, gets all of the resources that I mentioned in that hub slide. It's formed just by telling our vice president that you want to form a cluster, and it ends when the last person decides they're not interested anymore. So one of the, I think, nice examples of that recently was the drone cluster, which started almost as a joke 2 meetings ago. And then we had a student fellow who said, I'm using drones in my research, and this is a real topic. And the drones cluster has actually become, I think, one of our big success stories because drones is an interesting hardware tool. It has data management issues, and we've also seen our education committee pick up drones and start trying to get them into the classroom. So that's how this is emerging, and what we see also is emerging technology trends are often clusters first. So one of them that I wanted to highlight for this group, because it has an in-car connection, is the X-Domes, or is the Enviro Sensing cluster. And it was started originally by the LTER data managers and Corinna Grise. And so one of the first things they did was they created a sensor and sensor data management best practice wiki page. But I think it's a really beautiful example of being selfish. And so the current chair is Janet Fredericks, and she's a PI on the X-Domes EarthCube project, and she's now using the Enviro Sensing cluster to get community input into her X-Domes project. And so you can see that it's a very creative way to use your agenda. She's getting paid to participate in X-Domes, and she's choosing to work through the ESIP community. So that's, I think, a way that I would like more and more people to start to think about how to use ESIP to further their own goals. So the other end of the spectrum and more structured collaboration type is committees. Its chair is elected by the ESIP Assembly. They have budgets to enable people to travel, to enable small products to be created. And I think the standing committees really highlight sort of the overarching themes of ESIP. Data stewardship, semantic technology, information technology, and interoperability and education are all strong threads throughout the ESIP community, and the clusters that I mentioned really, I think, form kind of fall around these committees. And then we have some administrative committees, but we try to keep it very lightweight on the governance side of things. This is our leadership. Ted is in the audience. He's a type 3 rep. You might know Ethan Davis from Unidata, and the leadership will be changing in January. So one of the committees I wanted to mention, and I've already alluded to this a little bit, is the education work. And so while some groups meet monthly and have monthly telecons and kind of move through that way, the education group really is one where they have one key activity every year, and it's education teacher workshops where they co-locate with the ESIP summer meeting and they bring in local teachers. And this summer they also gave the teachers toy drones and taught them to fly and did a little flight school. And then they've recently come up with an ebook for lesson plans for using drones in the classroom. So it's been really neat to see how this has been evolving, completely driven by the community. So that leads to takeaway number 3. So one of the things that we know from Metcalfes law is that the value of the community is this, the nodes squared. But one of the things that we also have started to see in social networks is that when you have clusters in the network or subgroups of the network, that actually the effectiveness of the network or the value of the network is 2 to the n. And so this is Metcalfe's law. So this is the big, if you just have a giant community, and this is the value of the community if you have subgroups. And so we're seeing that, I think that value of ESIP, or the value of the ESIP clusters, that ESIP is a more resilient organization because we have these subgroups than if we had just one single group. So that leads to my last part of my talk, which is about things that ESIP produces. And this is really a new way for me to talk about ESIP. For most of my life, I've really just thought about the community and the value of the community, but not so much about products. But ESIP puts out best practices, provides consensus governance on conventions, professional development and outreach, and some creative funding. And so I'm going to talk through a couple of examples of these things. And there are links in these slides which will be shared if you want more information on any of this, this content. So the first is kind of our exemplar of the first ESIP product. And this came out in 2012 and was the Data Citation Guidelines. It was created by the Data Stewardship Committee. So they had this fairly intense collaborative committee process to pull it together. And then the ESIP assembly, so all of these members endorsed it. And we really didn't know what was going to happen next. And one interesting thing is that this served as the basis for other groups to pick up the ESIP data citation guidelines and make their own directives, and so, or their own guidance for their own organization. So NOAA, NSF, and GEO all picked it up. I'm most familiar with the NOAA Data Citation Directive, but it's a way that organizations that are participating in ESIP get this efficiency that they all didn't have to create data citation guidelines. They were able to just adopt what worked for them and leave the parts that didn't. And then since then, ESIP has also been influential in the continuing work and the broadening work of connecting to networks like Force 11, which is more on the publishing side, or the Research Data Alliance, which is broader both in terms of data coverage and geographically, because they're more international. But ESIP members have influenced the direction of this work. And so I think it's a nice example of partnering with other networks to move forward together. So I mentioned when I brought up Enviro Sensing, this document on the best practices for sensor networks and sensor data management. And this is really one that flew under the radar for us for a long time. The LTER group came in, they used the Enviro Sensing cluster for their own work, and they created this document on the wiki. And the great thing about it being on the wiki is that it's a living document that people can continue to evolve it over time. But this wasn't something that ESIP paid for. We didn't pay for it at all. So I think that's another kind of emergent activity out of the community that we can see benefits from. And then most recently, we have software guidelines. And these were just this afternoon approved by XCOM to be shared with the ESIP Assembly, who will adopt them like they adopted, or vote on them to choose to adopt, like the data citation guidelines. And again, none of this has teeth really, but it gives people a starting point to create guidelines for their own organizations. So one of moving from the best practices to the consensus governance, you might be familiar with the attribute conventions for data discovery, and this was something that was created by Unidata. And at a certain point, Unidata didn't want to maintain the governance over time, and it moved to the ESIP documentation cluster. They created within their own cluster a method to iterate on a new version, and the new version now lives on the wiki. So again, community consensus. On the professional development front, we were really at the forefront of data management, and Mike and I were just talking this afternoon that, when the NSF requirement for data management plans came out, there was a lot of scratching heads and thinking like, what do we do and how do we move this forward? And so ESIP has the data management training, which allows for you to figure out how to do a data management plan, and then it's self-paced. And then there are additional tools that are now following up on how to actually implement your data management plan. And another, since the data management training, we've also created the Data Management Training Clearinghouse, which is pulling training materials from across many different groups, such as USGS, Data One, and others, into a single place, so that that's another resource for the community. I think the last thing that I wanted to cover here is, some ways that you enable collaboration are by providing a little bit of seed funding. And these things in the testbed projects, which we're now calling incubators, or the Funding Friday Awards, these are meant to incentivize collaboration and really provide an opportunity for somebody to try something that was highly risky, that probably isn't going to work, would definitely not get funded by NSF. So these are some examples of those. The testbed is a solicitation that comes out twice a year. And those projects are funded around $8,000. And then at our summer meetings, as a way to incentivize collaboration at the meeting, we have something called Funding Friday Awards. And one of them that came out was this HIP Geo, which looked at all of the land-grant universities to see if there were additional members of ESIP or additional potential members of ESIP, and created this registry across all 50 states. So those are two mechanisms that we help to, kickstart some work. So I think, like I said when I started this section, that products are critical to realize the community work. And I think I didn't fully appreciate how, the community is really ephemeral. And, sometimes I've looked at other communities like the one that's around Drupal or other software products, and I thought, gosh, they're so lucky because they have some kind of solid, real thing. But I'm slowly starting to get to articulate, I think, hopefully more effectively, that ESIP has a lot of products, and these products are critical, and are really, one way that can, the community can leverage, members can leverage and be more efficient, and get more value out of ESIP. So this is just a recap. Be selfish. The community is a valuable resource. Leverage the backbone infrastructure to lower the barriers to collaboration. And one of the ways to do that is through clusters, and then that products are critical. And so I want to stop here and see what you think, because this is the first time I'm really articulating these ideas, and I'm curious kind of what your experience is in working in these collaborative communities, be it ESIP or something else, and how I should modify this. And then that's it. Thanks.
Okay.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I'm a big fan of ESIP, and I've participated for a long time. I was even at some of the very initial meetings as a DAC member. Nice. In the very beginning. Yeah. And I'm just wondering, I go to your meetings, and there is a lot of collaboration and discussion and interaction, and I want to see how that activity, which is just sharing of information, connects back to sort of your original goals, or the why you exist, and how is it actually moving things forward?
Like right to the heart. So I think maybe I'll start with the first part first, of how do the things at the meetings relate back to the strategic goals and to these, why we exist. And some of that is up to the so everything is member created, and one of the ways that we've tried to sort of push forward with these strategic goals is to remind people often, and you'll hear me over the course of the next year continue to kind of have the refrain that our theme for the year is to strengthen the connections between data providers and users. But I think your point is a really important one about then quantifying and making that real connection, and so we do it in maybe an end of the year fashion of like a wrap up annual report, but that's not really enough, and I don't think that's the kind of dynamic nature that we want to have of how we actually see that we're moving it forward. So that's I think something to think more on.
Or what would be different whether you existed or didn't exist?
Yeah. So I think what would be different if we didn't exist is that efficiency piece, right? That if we didn't exist and nobody filled the vacuum for this community, then everybody would have to figure out independently how to use a certain standard. Or, you would have 25 different metadata standards, those kind of things. I think where we see that we're maybe making progress is in that convergence. When we see, like, we have one example I can give is OpenSearch, where we had 4 different communities that had OpenSearch profiles, and they came together in ESIP's discovery cluster and converged. And then they went back to their home institutions. NASA and NOAA and USGS all were there, and they implemented the OpenSearch standard. So that's something that wouldn't have happened if we weren't there, or if there wasn't something like us there. Yeah.
Expand on it. But one concrete example that happened at NCAR was our data citation working group at NCAR that got us started with DataCite to issue DOIs. The white paper document heavily leveraged the work that ESIP had done, and so that was a group formed here at NCAR, but we relied on some of the things that had already done and accomplished. And to say that, well, if we follow these kinds of best practices, then we're also following the best practices for the community. We didn't have to sort of create our own. And data citation would be a very specific example, but maybe Matt wants to add something.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true, Mike. When we were first working on the data citation piece, the ESIP recommendations were where we started, for sure. And I think an extension of that is a couple years after we got started, I was on the AMS board on data stewardship, and then we were writing a data citation recommendation for AMS publications. And again, we directly referenced the ESIP recommendations in there in terms of what should be in a citation and things like that. So that's a good example of that. But I have a couple of separate questions, one kind of a functional one, and then one maybe about your points here. And the functional one is clusters and committee distinction, or not distinction, but relationship, in the sense that if somebody starts a committee, is there a process that sort of says, well, maybe that actually should be, somebody starts a cluster, wants to start a cluster, do they get pointed at, well, maybe that should be a committee activity in X committee?
Yeah, so the clusters are really easy and lightweight to start. And when clusters have kind of matured and evolved and seem like they're staying around and there's a lot of community interest in it, then it goes to the assembly to be voted on to be a committee. So it's a much bigger commitment by ESIP, by the assembly to stamp it. And one example of that is semantic web. That we had a semantic web cluster for a long time. It had done a lot of things as a cluster, and really it was the I think endorsement that it was important for ESIP in that kind of large thematic way to have it as a committee. Data stewardship was the same way. When data citation guidelines were approved, that was a big contribution, and I think the community felt like they should be a committee. So we don't take the committee thing lightly. I think the clusters are easier to maneuver most of the time.
So the other part of that question was if I have an idea to start a new cluster, would that review process point me to, say, the Semantic Committee? So if I'm new to the community, or I'm not really sure what the committees do, and I propose to do a link data something, would I get sort of redirected to the Semantic Committee instead of starting a cluster?
Maybe. I think the barrier to start a cluster is to email Christine, and I think our vice president, I think if she may say, like, you might want to look at the semantic web group before you start a cluster, but if you felt like it was sufficiently different, then it would go ahead.
And then my second question about your points here is, so I've been involved in EarthCube a fair amount, and in fact I was just in discussion today with one of the EarthCube committees, and they've really struggled with point 1 and point 5.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if you could reflect on, in the ESIP context, about the timeline, because you have these lessons now, but you didn't have these lessons at, say, year 5, which is where EarthCube is.
Yep.
And so I wonder if you could just comment on kind of the timeline of these communities, activities, and the backbones and so on, and what should the expectations be in that early parts of the timeline?
Yeah, so I think the backbone organization for ESIP formed about 5 years into the community. So ESIP formed in '98. The backbone started in 2001, 2002. Actually, I think 2003. I can do math up here. And so that's one point. But I mean, I think that's a really good point. Where I feel like the pivot happened when this Be Selfish maybe actually started to emerge was when people no longer were getting funding from NASA with part of it being tied to you must spend a quarter FTE on ESIP activities. And when that link broke, then people that wanted to stay engaged had to find a way to make it happen. And I think, over time we've seen it, more and more of that happen. And, I think that for EarthCube, I think the funding is, the funding or the potential for funding is still so much at the fore that it's hard for people to see how they might be selfish other than I'm here because I selfishly want to get funded. So that's one. And then I think products, we're about to turn 20, and I think my awareness of how important products are really came in the last year, and through some work with other organizations. So I think that could start any time though, because I've seen organizations that are much younger than ESIP place a heavier emphasis on products. So I think that would be something maybe to carry back to EarthCube about the necessity. Cool, good question.
Any other questions, comments, thoughts?
Thanks. I think, Matt asked an interesting question. I think on one of Erin's slides at the beginning, she had something about shared values. And I think that in EarthCube, in the NSF community in general, it tends to select people that don't share very well. It doesn't really reward sharing. The interesting thing about ESIP is if you look at the principal players, the agency players, NASA and NOAA, I think UCAR also, and USGS, it tends to self-select for people that want to share. So, and maybe EarthCube does that too. Erin brought up the interesting question of funding. The people that wanted to share in the early days of EarthCube were also getting funded by EarthCube or hoping to get funded by EarthCube. So it's a little bit different, but yeah, it is an interesting difference between those two communities and how they develop.
I think one other thing I'd say about EarthCube is heading back to this slide. I think one reason that ESIP has been successful is that we haven't tried to compete with other groups that are building cyber data infrastructure. And I think when EarthCube started to tackle that data infrastructure challenge, that's a completely different beast. And so, helping people come together around the common challenges and go back, then we're not trying to manage some sort of system of systems thing. Yeah, I love it.
Okay, so this is a slightly different question, but so there are all these organizations now: ESIP, EarthCube, RDA, Research Data Alliance. I think you may have mentioned one other one. Maybe there's two questions. A, what kinds of work do you need to do to work across these organizations to sort of find, where are the boundaries between what you do and what EarthCube does? And I know you are involved in all these things. How do you find those boundaries and what the optimal boundaries are? And then the second question is, do you feel that there still are gaps in sort of that coverage of these community activities? Like, is there still stuff that you see, not maybe it's not right for ESIP, but still could have some more development along these lines?
Yeah. So sort of roughly, the way that I've been thinking about how ESIP connects with RDA, one is through members, and members self-selecting into these other groups. And I think we have kind of a nice organic kind of cross-pollination of some of these groups just by the fact that the members are playing in multiple groups and coming, presenting EarthCube results at ESIP, presenting ESIP stuff at EarthCube. And so I'm not the sole responsible party to make sure that all these links are happening. For a couple of the other agency groups, it's easier to say, like USGS CDI, their Community for Data Integration, or NASA's Earth Science Data System Working Groups. They really take an agency look at the data challenges that they're focused on, and then when things that are common bubble up to ESIP. So, I don't think ESIP takes on really the agency-specific challenges so often. Some people may argue that some ESIP breakout sessions get a little NASA-specific, but that's a factor of what's contributed by the community to the meeting. Research Data Alliance, I think, is a really nice partner because it helps broaden ESIP's Earth Science niche, to a bigger audience. And ESIP is also primarily US-based, and so it's one way that we get that global reach too. And so I think, we saw the data citation guidelines get carried to RDA, get a lot more exposure than they would have gotten just with ESIP. So that partnership, I think, is a nice one. And we see that similarly with GEO, the Group on Earth Observations. GEO kind of sits at a higher level policy-wise, but focuses on Earth observations and is international. And so when ESIP, technical ESIP things get carried to GEO, again, it gets that reach. So those are nice partnerships. But then the gap piece, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on right now around mapping the landscape. And it's hard to tell kind of what's not covered yet. I think, there's an interest for like an ESIP Australia, and I struggle with how ESIP might internationalize, partly because the data challenges are common, and really the issue is the time zones. So what does an international thing look like? But that's one that comes to mind. Is there another part of your question? Cool.
One thing I've observed, and you described this overlap between membership of ESIP, EarthCube, RDA, there's a lot of overlap in the membership. One thing I've observed that sort of helped this non-duplication of effort is because of that overlap, people will say in an EarthCube initiative, well, why are we doing, we don't need to spend our time doing that. ESIP's already taken care of it, or RDA's already taken care of it. So this efficiency and the value of having efficiencies is really an important value that this community has. So many times I'll totally support that position. That this has already been dealt with by ESIP. It's the data citation guidelines or data management courses that would be an example. So there's no reason to do that with another funding mechanism. So I've seen that happen over and over again because of that overlap.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
This might be totally irrelevant and off track, but I really liked your very first slide about the hurricane and the brother.
Yeah.
And what struck me was, as a taxpayer, we spent hundreds of millions of dollars for the image on the right and virtually nothing for the image on the left. And so that even though that one might be a lot more useful and accessible and all that, we pay for that.
Yeah.
And
That's true. That's a great point. Yeah, we definitely do pay for it. Yeah, I think it was such a win, to be able, I had no idea what I was going to find when I was searching for it, and that, the Weather Service keeps that page for all hurricanes. Is a really nice thing.
I have one question still, and that's the connection to WMO. I mean, they're dealing with all of these issues on a very large scale, but I haven't heard that mentioned here at all.
Yeah, actually, I might punt to my husband, Ted. So ESIP doesn't directly interact with WMO so much. One sort of tangential way is through GEO, the Group on Earth Observations. We're a participating organization and have participated in GEOS and pilots, but I think WMO would be a really interesting partner for exactly that reason. But I know that Ted has done some work with WMO in the international standards realm of things. So Ted, I don't know, thoughts on?
Yeah, I think the biggest
Microphone.
in WMO, I think there's two challenges. The first one Erin already mentioned, which is the international meeting, pulling together the international, scheduling those kind of community meetings is more of a challenge, and I think the WMO is the governance of WMO is still also pretty international. So many in some cases that makes that makes the dynamics of the community interaction difficult and sometimes slow. But it has the expert teams. The WMO expert teams are a little bit similar to the ESIP clusters, and they also make recommendations I think there's a lot of parallels between the two organizations, and certainly, as you mentioned, sort of in the goals and the problems that they face.
Yeah.
The ways that they, bringing in representatives, experts from a bunch of countries. I mean, I also participate in OGC and ISSA, the same kinds of things. Their international decision-making processes, they're fraught. In ways that interagency decision-making processes in the United States either are or not. But anyway, this is a good set of parallels.
Yeah, and I wonder, we may have overlapping, federal partners that are on WMO committees and I'm not aware of it. That might be one way, but I think, looking at it more strategically is a good point.
Okay. Any last question? No? Then let's thank Erin one last time.
Thank you.